Science, as we've seen, sheds light on the ways in which our universe works and the laws that make life on Earth possible. But science can't always answer the why questions. Why is there gravity in the first place? Why is there life at all? Or as some have asked before, why is there something rather than nothing? The question of origin asks where everything came from in the first place. It sometimes seems like science and faith are enemies with little to say to each other. But actually, there was a time when science and faith were understood as friends. Theology, the study of God, was considered the queen of the sciences. And some of the greatest scientific heroes were Christians who made their discoveries in light of their belief in God's presence in the universe. Their faith was the foundation for their research. Is it possible to go through life without thinking about the hows and whys of the universe at all? Sure. But you'll have to be more comfortable with ignoring questions like how did the world begin? And how is it that life is somehow possible on our one small planet when the universe is hostile and chaotic? Maybe these still seem like questions that don't really matter when you come right down to it. But sometimes it's hard to press on when you're told that life is nothing more than a coincidence, an accident, or a fluke. Sometimes it's hard to understand your own world when you haven't got a clue how this world came into being, where it came from, and why. We're back now with my dad, Ravi Zacharias. Dad, thanks for being here. We've been talking about the issue of science and our origin. When it comes to science and faith in God, can science prove that there is a God?
Science is just one of the disciplines of testing truth claims. Many times you think of a single strand of evidence, and that is really not the way to judge the question. That brings together philosophical assumptions and philosophical statements. So you have to bring both science and philosophy, and there are various other disciplines that will be brought to bear upon testing this. But science alone is not the sole judge on a matter such as this.
Why is it that we as Christians are so easily intimidated by the scientific field?
I think because science has sort of, in the last few years particularly, tried to hijack the whole area of truth, as if the only truth you can know for certain is scientific truth. When you think about it in terms of life and its major challenges, moral reasoning, issues of romance and love and values, all of the metaphysical questions that come to bear when you're making decisions in your day-to-day life, these are not scientific questions. These are questions of value and worth that is outside of the purview of science. But science, when it becomes this kind of an authoritative discipline, intimidates people, and you're afraid of making any claim to any truth if you cannot justify it in scientific terms.
I mentioned earlier in the discussion that a number of years ago, theology and science used to be considered co-equal in terms of their authority. Was it a mistake to depart from that?
You know, it used to be, theology used to be called the queen of the sciences, and then theology got evicted from the academy, and they made it religion and the departments of religion. And of course, religion is humanity's search for spiritual values. Strictly speaking, theology was God's search for man as it was understood in the Judeo-Christian framework. That parting of the ways has been unfortunate because there have been great scientists, Isaac Newton, Faraday, and you come into more recent times, you've got Francis Collins, John Polkinghorne, one of the world's leading quantum physicists, who was the dean at Queen's College in Cambridge, under whom I studied. Great scientists, great followers and believers in Jesus Christ. Our own colleague, John Lennox, who's professor of pure mathematics at Green College in Cambridge as well. So to make this dichotomy is something that strident atheists have done, and it's a false dichotomy. They have converging points at which they ought to meet and do meet.
We always hear the term evidence, and it's kind of hammered away, evidence, and the importance of it. Is it possible to actually live by sheer evidence alone, or do the scientists themselves draw on faith to verify their own principles?
That's a very important question. I have often put it in these words: God has put enough into this world to make faith in him a most reasonable thing, and he's left enough out to make it impossible to live by sheer reason alone. Nobody in this world lives without faith. The only difference is whether your faith is based, is more like credulity or no evidence of any kind, or your faith and reasoning converge very well. You get into a plane, you get into a car. Yes, you've got the evidence that the pilot is supposed to be licensed and the plane is supposed to be checked up, but you don't go and check all those papers. You're expressing faith in a certain set of tests that are already assumed. I would like to ask the scientist this question: why is it important that the scientist doing his or her testing report their findings truthfully? Now, if they say yes, what is the scientific argument for that? The pragmatic answer, the pragmatic argument could be something completely different. We all converge with moral reasoning, with legitimate faith, and with empirical evidence. And in the Christian faith, all of these validly are enjoined and used.
I'd like to ask you about the fact that the Bible tells us we're made in the image of God, but I'd like you to kind of frame it through a story I've heard you say, talking about Dr. Francis Collins, who was one of the co-mappers of the Human Genome Project. How would that story maybe illustrate the fact that we're made in the image of God, and what does that mean?
The image of God, technically speaking, brings 2 points together. Number one is our moral reasoning and our individual freedom. So theologically, that's the way it is used. But the fact that Dr. Collins used it was more to demonstrate the issue of intelligibility and design. And this is the way he did it. When he showed the stained glass window from York Minster Cathedral in England, and the people just looked at the screen and marveled at the beauty of it, thousands of cut pieces brought together, nobody would have even questioned whether it happened by accident or whether somebody designed it. They were quite taken by it. Then he uncovered the second half of the screen and showed the cross-section of the human DNA, which has 3.1 billion bits of information. And the extraordinary thing is, when you look at the first, you know there's intelligibility, you know there's a designer, you know there's beauty, and the awe that you have in response is legitimate. Why is it you switch the scene and look at something even more complex, even more clearly intelligible, and so magnificent in its beauty that all of a sudden you switch the ways of testing truth and assume that that happened by accident? I think Francis Collins' response was quite fascinating. After he finished showing those slides, he basically picked up his guitar and sang a gospel song. The response is one of worship. So science and spiritual reasoning in the Christian faith are not enemies. They are friends and ought to be friends, and one ought not to claim that kind of sovereignty as if it is the total way of testing truth in all matters of life.
I know you receive letters from students who say they are treated as enemies in the scientific classroom. How can they address that? How can they respond to those attacks? They don't have the education of a professor, nor necessarily the training and education of an apologist. So how can they respond to that?
Well, it's interesting, actually. I get letters from people in course of art, for psychology, in all of the arts courses, and in the inexact sciences and the exact sciences. It is often the prejudice that a professor brings to these disciplines, and we ought to be very careful to be able to identify that. It's because a person oftentimes misuses their own discipline to somehow dominate the worldview of the student that they are talking to. I put it this way: life at its core is sacred, meaning it's of essential worth. And there is no scientific discipline in this world that can attribute that kind of essential worth to every human being. And the fact that they make that assumption that science is the sole discipline, but at the same time consider their opinion valuable because they're valuable, is actually borrowing from outside science to justify the authority that they are assuming in order to give themselves credit.
Well, thanks very much, Dad, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you.